Welcome back to part 2 of my historical review on the musical Hamilton. If you haven't checked out part 1, please go and do so, but essentially in part 1, I discussed Hamilton's upbringing and his arrival to the colonies. The musical was pretty accurate, but I believe the timeline should have been shifted, with Burr and Hamilton meeting in 1772 rather than 76. Events such as Seabury's letter, Hamilton stealing the cannons, Angelica being single, all would have made more sense if the musical had been set earlier in the 70s. I also addressed some of the ships, such as Hamilton, Lawrence, and Lafayette, Angelica and Jefferson, Angelica and Hamilton. All of these relationships could be interpreted as flirtatious or romantic, looking at it from a modern lens, but considering the writing etiquette in the 1700s being much more expressive and grandiose, I concluded that's hard to say if any of these people romantically liked each other or not. Speaking of relationships though, let's continue this review starting with the song Wait For It, where Aaron Burr talks about his relationship with Theodosia, a woman 10 years his senior.
I'm keeping her bed warm while her husband is away. He's on the British side in Georgia. He's trying to keep the colonies in line. Well, he can keep all of Georgia. Theodosia, she's mine.
Theodosia was married to a British officer, but she herself was a patriot and contributed much to the revolution. She volunteered her home to become a meeting place for revolutionaries, and many revolutionaries such as Hamilton, Lafayette, and of course Aaron Burr used the space. Burr and Theodosia meet in 1778, and his frequent visits to her home start a secret romance. By 1780, many people knew about this relationship through gossip circles. And Hamilton asks Burr, why doesn't he just make it official with Theodosia? Why not fight for her and steal her, essentially, from her husband? But Burr has a different mindset. He chooses to wait for it and not rush things. This mindset of hanging back and waiting for the right timing translates to many other things in Burr's life. And this contrasts with Hamilton's style of just rushing into things. Burr recognizes that Hamilton is getting ahead in life thanks to his always-on-the-go personality, but he believes that his strategy to be patient is the correct one in the long run. A line I want to highlight from this song.
My grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher. But there are things that the homilies and hymns won't teach ya. My mother was a genius. My father commanded respect. When they died, they left no instructions, just a legacy to protect.
Burr's family on both maternal and paternal side were religious and came from a line of preachers and theologians. But by age 2, Burr was an orphan, and he and his sister were both raised by an abusive uncle. So although Burr came from a prominent family, he definitely did have a tough childhood. The next song we get is Stay Alive, which starts with Hamilton taking over George's correspondence, telling Congress that shit's bad and they've resorted to eating their horses, which I couldn't confirm. Although many horses did die during Valley Forge, and we know George wrote about the horrible smell of dead horses. Ugh. Anyways, this terrible winter in Valley Forge leads into the Battle of Monmouth, which took place in the summer of 1778. Oh my god, are you kidding, Lynn? Didn't we just have
1780, a winter's ball?
We just went back 2 years in the timeline. Awesome. But anyways, we're in New Jersey.
Instead of me, he promotes Charles Lee, makes him second in command.
I'm a general.
Yeah.
And the musical Lee is a total joke. But in reality, he was an experienced general. He fought in the 7-Year War as a British soldier and even served in the Polish army for a while. And when revolution first broke out, he really wanted to become commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But of course, George was chosen. So he served as a general. And he did pretty well, but he was always really critical of Washington. Most of this bitterness was probably jealousy, but some of his criticism was valid. Anyways, Lee was captured by the British for a while and was a prisoner of war for like a year and a half, until he was exchanged right before the Battle of Monmouth. Washington, for some reason, still really trusted Lee, despite his friends telling him how much Lee was shit-talking about Washington behind his back. Washington put Lee in charge of a third of the army and sent him ahead to strike the British, but Lee totally screwed up. So the army retreated and waited for George to arrive with the rest of the crew to fight back. In the musical, George puts Lafayette in charge after Lee screws up.
Have Lafayette take the lead! Yes, sir!
But the story is actually a little bit different. Lafayette was in command of the reserve during Monmouth, but Washington formed a vanguard and asked Lee to lead, but Lee felt that the vanguard was too small for someone of his status to be taken care of, so he refused. So Washington put Lafayette in charge. But Lafayette was still pretty inexperienced. He was only 20 at the time and kind of screwed up, so Lee came back and took control of the vanguard. After the battle, Lee claimed that he was innocent, that it was poor direction from Washington that screwed things up. In the musical, Washington is quiet, calm, and tells Hamilton history will prove Lee wrong, but in reality, Washington was pissed. He launched an official inquiry into Lee's conduct. Lee was charged with disobeying orders and not attacking on the morning of the battle, for conducting an unnecessary, disorderly, and shameful retreat, and for disrespect towards the commander-in-chief. The first two cases were kind of dubious, but Lee was convicted of the final charge. In the musical, this isn't mentioned at all, and Washington is just this patient sage. Instead, in the musical, Lawrence takes offense to Lee slandering Washington and challenges him to a duel. And there really was a duel between Lawrence and Lee in December of 1778. This leads into the next song.
10 duel commandments.
Dueling stems from a tradition from medieval Europe and was a way of settling arguments and defending one's honor. They obviously used to use swords for dueling, but by the 1700s it was common for there to be pistol duels. There was a set of rules for dueling. I mean, there was more than 10, but Lynn simplified this to tell us the simple version of how the duels work. Hamilton served as Lawrence's second, but Burr actually wasn't Lee's second. Evan Edwards was. But I get that Lynn didn't want to add any extra characters, and Burr being Lee's second adds more tension between Burr and Hamilton's relationship. Lawrence shoots Lee in the side, but unlike the musical, Washington probably did not care and was maybe happy about this duel happening. But of course, in the musical, Washington pulls Hamilton aside and tells him that Hamilton doesn't need to defend Washington's honor on his behalf. This leads into the argument in which Hamilton complains that he wants to fight, that he doesn't want to just sit around and write George's letters for him. Washington snaps and Hamilton is dismissed from service. In reality, Hamilton resigned from his post in 1781 after feeling that his wish to be on the battlefield was being ignored by George. But the trigger for the argument that led to Hamilton's resignation is actually pretty funny. Hamilton went to deliver a letter but was late returning because Lafayette distracted him. And so George got a little pissy, which led into this conversation where Hamilton resigned. But anyways, back to the musical, we learned that George was being protective of Hamilton and not wanting him to be on the battlefield because he knew that Eliza was pregnant and wanted to make sure Hamilton was alive to see his son. The timeline of this whole musical is messed up, so I mean, Hamilton wouldn't have met Eliza yet at the Battle of Monmouth, and therefore he wouldn't have had a son. Anyways, let's move on to the next song.
He's constantly confusing, confounding the British henchmen. Everyone give it up for America's favorite fighting Frenchman!
Lafayette was a key figure in the American Revolution as the middleman between France and the USA. And there were other French allies like Rochambeau mentioned later in the song. And I mean, seriously, the help we got from France cannot be understated. As I mentioned in part 1, the colonies were really reliant on trade with Britain and lacked many industries to support the war effort. Without the help from France, they would not have been able to secure many of the resources that they needed. So remember Hamilton quit his job with Washington for a while? Well, that didn't last for long. Hamilton came back pretty quickly. And Washington finally gave him a field assignment. But Washington warns Hamilton to be careful. Chasing the glory of war can lead to making huge mistakes. And Washington speaks from his own experience of his first command on field.
I was younger than you are now when I was given my first command. I led my men straight into a massacre. I witnessed their deaths firsthand.
Washington was a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia colony militia and led a small expedition against the French. This was 1754, so George was only 22 years old. As a reference, Hamilton was 26 during the Battle of Yorktown, although he probably would have claimed that he was 24. This fight was a total disaster and was actually one of the trigger events to launching the 7 Years' War. And this was a truly traumatic experience for Washington. He was responsible for the death of many people, and so he resigned from his military post and just returned to being a tobacco planter in Virginia. And if Washington hadn't achieved so much later in his life, he probably would have been remembered for those big military mistakes. He warns Hamilton,
History has its eyes on me.
We proceed into
The Battle of Yorktown, 1781.
Lafayette says that after helping America, he'll bring freedom to his own people as well. To be honest though, 1781 was a bit too early for thoughts of French Revolution to be in Lafayette and most other people's minds. For the Americans, the French king was awesome for agreeing to help out with their war efforts, so I mean, it's kind of a dick move to be like, lol, go cut off the French king's head now. It's also to be noted that Lafayette came from an aristocratic background and had many connections to the French royal family. He was a fan of democracy, but wanted a constitutional monarchy like what Britain had. Anyway, so Hamilton is finally on the battlefield and he performs very well in Yorktown. And we learn what the rest of the crew are up to. Lawrence is in South Carolina being a vocal abolitionist, yes. Awesome. And we learned that Mulligan was acting as a spy. As a tailor in New York, Mulligan had many British soldiers and officers as customers, and was very good at asking the right questions to get information out of them. To be honest, what's more interesting is Mulligan's slave, Cato, I don't know how to pronounce this, but he was a black patriot who also spied on the British, and he was able to do so because he was unassuming as a slave. I think his story is really fascinating. I really want to know more about Cato. Anyways, they finally win the Battle of Yorktown after a week of fighting, and it's true that the British surrendered with a white flag. So the Americans won, and now we get to see King George's reaction.
They say the price of my war's not a price that they're willing to pay.
So it kind of sounds like this line is aimed at the Americans, but I actually interpreted this to be aimed at the ministers. Remember we discussed in part 1 that England was already a constitutional monarchy at this point, meaning a lot of the important decision making was done by ministers. King George actually really wanted to continue fighting the war for the sake of his pride, but the ministers told him to stop. So I kind of read this line as like a jab to his own ministers who wouldn't let him continue his temper tantrum. Anyways, George ponders what the Americans will do now that they've won their revolution. And I mean, this is a pretty legit point. If you study history, you know that causing a revolution is relatively easy compared to actually forming a new functional government after the revolution is over. But before we move on to discussing these issues, we get a pretty personal song.
Dear Theodosia, what to say to you? You have my eyes, you have your mother's name.
Burr and Hamilton both sing about their children. Hamilton's son Philip was born in 1782 and Burr's daughter Theodosia, named after her mom, was born in 1783. This duet is really interesting. Hamilton and Burr are set up as opposites in many ways, but they're also so similar.
My father wasn't around. I swear that I'll be around for you.
They were both orphans and had a tough life. And in the end, their goal is to create a safe and stable environment for their kids to grow up in. But this very optimistic song is followed by Eliza delivering a letter to Hamilton. A letter from John Lawrence's father, telling him that John has died. The way Lawrence died is really depressing because, as mentioned in the musical, the war was already over and the British were retreating. But hot-headed Lawrence got involved in an unnecessary brawl, and got himself killed. It's tragic that he died in such a senseless fight, when there was so much more he could have accomplished if he had lived longer.
After the war, I went back to New York.
After the war, I went back to New York.
I finished up my studies and I practiced law.
I practiced law. Burr worked next door.
Yup, both Burr and Hamilton passed the bar in 1782, and they both set up shop in New York. It was common for lawyers to work in the southern tip of Manhattan in what we call the financial district today. And yeah, it's totally possible that Burr and Hamilton's offices were right next to each other. And Hamilton and Burr did work together occasionally, most notably the first ever murder trial in the country. This is actually kind of wild because Hamilton was a commercial lawyer, very different from civil law. But I mean, like, seriously, Hamilton was a genius. Like, he didn't go to law school, by the way. He studied law on his own for like 6 months. And because he was a veteran of the war, he was exempt from having to complete an apprenticeship to pass the bar. People recognize Hamilton's intelligence, and he was invited to participate in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, where he really did give a 6-hour-long speech.
Goes and proposes his own form of government. What? His own plan for a new form of government. What? Talks for 6 hours. The convention is listless.
Hamilton was a fan of the British political system. He believed in a strong central government and, to be honest, thought we should get rid of the states. And this difference between a Federalist mindset, with power concentrating on the federal level, versus the Republican mindset, where each state has autonomy, is going to come up later in the musical. And okay, sure, this is not an unreasonable opinion to have, but actually Hamilton held other political opinions that would be kind of controversial. Hamilton didn't trust the common people to have the ability to participate in politics. He thought that a group of elites should lead and believed that the president as well as senators should serve for life. He even thought it'd be a good idea to bring an elective monarchy and have non-titled aristocrats in America. None of this is mentioned in the musical, obviously. In the musical, Hamilton is the man of the people, even though in reality he was an elitist. He thought America needed to be ruled by landholders, merchants, and men of learned professions. I understand why Lynn didn't include this side of Hamilton. It makes for a nicer story to see this poor immigrant come in and fight for everything that we think is right. Hamilton's been made more palatable for the modern audience. I get why he had to do that, but I mean, I'll just say it. I think it's kind of misleading. But that's what makes it fun for me to make these videos, these historical review videos. And I hope people go and do their own research or watch videos like mine after watching Hamilton to get kind of a full picture of this founding father. Anyways, let's get back to the Constitutional Convention and figure out what happened. The Constitution was written, but many people disagreed with it, and it would be up to each state to ratify or reject the Constitution. And in order for the Constitution to take effect, 9 out of the 13 states would have to ratify, and this needed to happen fast. The existing government was totally collapsing. Everything was just chaos. Hamilton decided he was going to defend the Constitution and try to convince others to accept it. I couldn't find any evidence that Hamilton asked Burr to join him in his efforts to defend the Constitution, but I get why Lynn included this scene. It adds to the difference between Hamilton and Burr. Anyways, in the musical, this is when Angelica finally gets married to her rich British husband and goes to London. In the musical, she marries out of social necessity, but again, to remind you, in reality, she married for love, going so far as to marry this man even though her father disagreed. Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay decide to join forces to defend the Constitution, and they write the Federalist Papers.
John Jay got sick after writing 5. James Madison wrote 29. Hamilton wrote the other 51.
And yup, those numbers are accurate. Hamilton wrote a huge chunk of these papers. Washington is elected as president in 1789 and invites Hamilton to be his Secretary of Treasury. And of course, Hamilton accepts the position. And that's the end of Act 1. I gotta say, I know Lin had a lot that he had to pack into this musical, so I can't blame him for omitting some facts. But it does seem like he's omitting some of Hamilton's more controversial opinions, like his desire to make America a monarchy and the general elitist vibe. But let's see how Hamilton's portrayed in part 2 of the musical. That video should be up sometime next week. Thank you so much for watching. Please check out some of the other historical reviews that I've done and let me know your thoughts.